Hi, good evening. I'd like to welcome you to Poem Praise 2. And peace and blessings be upon you and your family this evening. Now, we are going to get right back into Black Stars, African American women writers. And right now, we are on Zora Neale Hurston during the time period of 1891 to 1960. So without further ado, it reads as such. A tragedy in the careers of many artists is that their work may not generate enough income to support them during their lifetime. Zora Neale Hurston, I said Houston, excuse me, Miss Hurston, the best known female author of the Harlem Renaissance, is a classic example. She never earned as much as $1,000 in royalties during her entire life. But today, her books earn thousands of dollars each year. Her name and her talent are now recognized and valued. Zora Neale Hurston Writers Festival is held annually in Eatonville, Florida, the town where she was born. The seventh of 8 children of the Reverend John and Lucy Potts Hurston, Zora grew up in Eatonville. In those days, it was an all-black town. When Hurston lost her mother at age 13, she was passed around among a series of relatives. It was a situation that made her grow up quickly and become fiercely independent as she took different odd jobs. One of those jobs was a traveling maid to an actress with the Gilbert and Sullivan Company, a dramatic personality in her own right. Hurston worked her way to Washington, D.C., where she sporadically attended Howard University and wrote short stories. While studying at Howard, she had her first short story published. She later studied folk art and anthropology at Barnard College in New York City and is recorded as its first black graduate. Meantime, she continued writing stories. New York City was the home of the Harlem Renaissance, which produced a vast body of work by black writers in the 1920s. Hurston became closely acquainted with many of the leading black literary figures of the day, including Langston Hughes. Hurston's short stories and novels expressed her feelings about the black community. For example, Color Struck addressed the theme of color bias. It is the story of a dark-skinned woman who goes mad because she cannot believe that a man can love someone of her complexion. Hurston, herself of a lovely brown hue, recalled in her 1942 autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road, that as a child she felt confusion about black pride. She remembered thinking, if it was so honorable and glorious to be black, why was it the yellow-skinned people among us had so much privilege? As far back as first grade, she recalled the light-skinned children were always chosen for the good parts of fairies and angels. Hurston also wrote about the ways people could be blinded by greed. In her short story, The Gilded Six Bits, a con artist comes to a small town and dazzles a woman with fake gold. Money also figured in her most celebrated novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, 1937. Written in poetic black dialect, their eyes were watching God. Tales of a love and tragedy, in the life of Janie Crawford, a bride of 16. Janie, who lives in a small southern town very much like the one in which Zora was raised, is forced into an unloving marriage by her grandmother, who feels she knows what is best for her granddaughter. Having had to struggle all her life, Janie's grandmother is only concerned with wealth. She readily dismisses Janie's views about romance and insists that her granddaughter marry an elderly man. The novel ends with Janie eventually finding true love in the character of Tea Cake, a spirited young man who she describes as being like a bee to a blossom. Today, this novel has sold more than 1 million copies, and in 1990 was brought by television personality Oprah Winfrey and musician Quincy Jones for film production. But in the 1930s, not everyone appreciated Hurston's talent. In a period where the black elite thought the black race had to look upright and dignified, Hurston, in their opinion, was not helping their cause. They accused her of representing a circus-like side of black life. She was accused of taking advantage of ordinary black people by telling humorous stories about their lives to make white people laugh. Critics also accused Hurston of making light of the harshness of Southern black life. Hurston ignored her critics and held on to her beliefs. In later years, Zora Neale Hurston was one of the few voices to dare question the soundness of the 1954 U.S. Supreme Court Brown versus Board of Education decision, which declared segregated schools unconstitutional. Recalling her own education in Edenville, Hurston argued that a black child didn't necessarily need to be seated next to a white student to learn well. White segregationalists welcomed the position she took, while blacks distanced themselves from her. Blacks felt that comments like Hurston's could only hurt their cause. Critics in the black press also wrote harsh stories about her personal life. Distance from family members, Hurston was without close support. With her few financial resources, including a $500 advance for her next book, the beleaguered writer returned to Florida. Once these funds were depleted, Zora Neale Hurston, a woman accustomed to making her own way in the world, took a job as a maid. Hurston employers discovered that their maid, whom they referred to as the girl, was the same person they saw in a magazine. They reported the story to Miami Herald. When Hurston was called on to respond, embarrassment caused her to lie and say that she was working as a maid to gather research. She was twice married and divorced. She explained to her friends that marriage had stood in the way of her writing. She is reported to have had a long and serious relationship with a young man who may have been her one true love, and who perhaps was the inspiration for the fictional character of Tea Cake. Despite her devotion to him, however, the relationship did not last. Like many writers, she opted for the solitary life, or solitary. life, a subject she addresses in her autobiography. She writes, "I have come to know by experience that work is the nearest thing to happiness that I can find." Zora felt destined to be a loner. "I played, fought, and studied with other children," she recalls, "but always stood apart." Though she was described in her final years as a poor woman living in dilapidated, dilapidated, I'm going to spell it for y'all because I might have said that incorrectly, dilapidated building, where she paid $5 per week. Her correspondence to her publisher suggested she remained optimistic. In one of her letters, she told her editor, "I am living the kind of life for which I was born, strenuous and close to the soil." The book she was working on for Scribner's was rejected, but Hurston did not give up. After moving to Cocoa, Florida, she attempted to revise the book. Later, she moved to Fort Pierce, where she worked as a librarian and teacher. In 1959, a stroke forced her to enter Fort Lucie County Welfare Home, where she died on January 28, 1960, at age 69. Now, I do have another picture in here I'm going to show you. This is Langston Hughes right here. And I'll read that short section up under his name, which states, "The poet Langston Hughes was a leading figure in the Harlem Renaissance. His poetry painted vivid images of African American life. Collaborating with Hurston, he wrote the play Mule Bone." Now, the last section I have for you on Zora is In Search of Zora. Zora Neale Hurston's writing were reintroduced to the public by the contemporary writer Alice Walker, a native Southerner herself. Walker closely identified with Hurston's stories and waged a passionate one-woman campaign to unearth, and bring to light the writings of Zora Neale Hurston and other Black women writers who were simply out of print. She wrote numerous articles about the author's personal struggle as an artist. She lectured about the life and work of Hurston and eventually produced the book I Love Myself When I Am Laughing, a Zora Neale Hurston Reader, 1979, an article written for Miss Magazine, In Search of Zora Neale Hurston, 1975, resulted in an outpouring of interest in the writer. While searching the backlands of Florida in 1973, Alice Walker found Hurston's grave in an isolated, weeded area. At the site of the author's grave, she placed a headstone that reads, "A genius of the South." And that does complete Zora Neale Hurston as one of the African American writers here on Poem Praise 2. I do want you to stay tuned for our next writer, which she's right there. And everyone, that is Dorothy West during the time period of 1907 to 1998. So it be it thy will. I'll talk with you soon here on Poem Praise 2. I do want you to be well and take care of yourself. Be blessed. Till next time. here on Poem Praise too. Later, y'all.